All right, welcome to another episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Ben Burgis. He's a columnist for Jacobin Magazine, an adjunct philosophy professor at Rutgers University, an online instructor at the School for Social and Cultural Change, and the host of the podcast and YouTube show, Give Them an Argument. He's the author of several books, including Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left, and his newest book, Christopher Hitchens, What He Got Right, How He Went Wrong, and Why He Still Matters. Welcome, Ben.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, man. And so something that we've been talking about, and obviously something I already shared with Ben, is this book is legit one of my favorite books in the past probably 3 to 4 years. So not only because of how much I love Christopher Hitchens, but also just because of the fact of how nuanced it is. So I want to first read a quote and a passage from it, and then kind of, we're going to start talking about what he thought about him. All right. So Ben writes, regardless of which Hitch we ended up with, I suspect that if the cancer had gone into remission for a decade and he died yesterday, I would have ended up having the same mixed feelings about him that I had in 2011. I hated parts of his work and loved most of the rest. He was always worth reading and watching, and he was always worth thinking about and arguing with in your head. That's very far from being a nothing. Christopher Hitchens spent years writing for Slate. Can you remember reading anything at Slate in 2019 or 2020 or 2021 that made you think? How about Salon? How about the Daily Beast? Can you remember anything you read in any of these places that made you grumble? Damn, that's really good, even though you disagreed with the author's conclusion? Hell, could you remember a single turn of phrase from anything you read in any of these places more than a week ago? So that's perfect, man. That literally captures how amazing of a thinker he was. It's like, yeah, just like, wow, man, just like thinking about it. And, because so many of us disagree with later Hitch, but it's sort of, it matters and it doesn't matter because he still gave you these ideas that at the very least, made you a little bit kind of despise him, right? And it made you think like, here's why it's kind of worth my time to try to figure out why he's wrong and try to disagree with him. But before we really get into kind of why he's wrong and obviously, later Hitch and how that came about, can you tell us a bit about how he rose to prominence and how he even became important in the first place?
Sure. It's funny, that quote that you just read, a couple of months ago, Anthony Fisher, who just took over as the opinion editor at the Daily Beast, invited me to write some articles for them. And like, I haven't actually asked him, but I've always really wanted to know whether like he read that or not. Right. That I just insulted them in the book. But in any case, maybe he read that, maybe he didn't. But I would stand by that. Although at least he only took over very recently there. So
well, we can say that about most publications if you think about it.
I was just kind of picking like a few sort of places that are in the same kind of lane as like what something like Slate is, right? That they are that kind of liberalish sort of online commentary speaking to a broadly similar audience. And it's very I think it is like really striking how different, like, if you go back and read, like, not that it's necessarily my favorite of his work or anything, but like if you go back and read some of the stuff that Hitchens wrote for Slate, it is really, really hard to imagine that. Now, like there's something really striking about the idea that you'd just be like kind of clicking around some publication like that, and you'd run into one of these Hitchens essays, like even the one, he wrote this essay pretty late, like late 2000s, about the way that the British Empire bequeathed the phrase "fuck off" to much of the developing world. That introducing that to people's vocabulary, is said along with cricket, one of the most enduring legacies of it. And it's like this very funny essay. It's very like historically informed. It's like really subtly brought out, and then there's this like kind of point at the end about how basically the United States can't stay in Iraq for that much longer, or it's going to be really bad, and that he's making in this really subtle, funny way at the end through this. And I just have a hard time imagining, like, whatever. And I'll include myself in the criticism, right? I don't write anything that good, that they have so I think, yeah, I think some of that does probably come out of this kind of unique background, which gets to what you were just asking about. So Hitchens had in the 70s, he was a writer for this left-wing British magazine, much more left-wing back then, the New Statesman, where he worked with people like Martin Amis and Julian Barnes, the novelist, and then in the early 80s, he like at the beginning of the 80s, he went to the United States first for this like kind of 1 year, I think, exchange program that the New Statesman was having with the nation of the United States, you know, where like somebody from the New Statesman would go work for a year for the nation, and I think still have the New Statesman pay their salary, and somebody from the nation, you know, went over to Great Britain and worked for the New Statesman for a year, but then Hitchens decided that he liked it and he wanted to stay. And interestingly enough, Victor Navasky was the longtime publisher of the Nation. He wrote this thing after Hitchens died, where he mentioned when they were first trying to figure out like what he would do with the Nation, right? You know, like they definitely wanted to like keep him, right? You know, when he said he wanted to just like move there and stay there. But like what he would do, and one of the initial ideas was that he was going to write this column about Wall Street, which I think is this wonderful little what if, because I think that probably would have been an amazing column. And I think if he'd been sort of grounded in sort of writing about the depravities of Wall Street every week, you know, then that might have been, you know, I mean, you have to wonder if his politics would have evolved in the same way that they did later on, because of course, that wasn't his main beat, right? What he was really doing with his column, you know, the Minority Report at the Nation, was, you know, I mean, he'd talk about a variety of different subjects, and you know, I think sometimes people overestimate the degree to which he wasn't really that interested in domestic policy. He was very passionate about the death penalty, for example, and other subjects, but like most of what he was talking about most of the time was foreign policy. And in particular, and I think this could be important for understanding what happened to him later, like a lot of what he was really interested in was stuff like in the 80s, was stuff like the you know, the Reagan administration's support for these like dirty wars in Latin America, you know, this kind of death squad right-wing dictatorships. And so that's a lot of what he was very focused on. And going into the 90s, you know, like he writes, and this is when he's just starting to become a little bit bigger. And although it's always interesting, because I think he did, just because maybe the Nation is like just prominent enough of a magazine, and just because Hitchens himself had like such a big personality and was so charming and all that stuff, like he did have a little bit of an outsized presence even in the, you know, even in the 80s and early 90s. So, you know, he was like on C-SPAN all the time, which leads to some really funny things, because this is back when he still very much considers himself to be a socialist. So like you get these hilarious clips on C-SPAN where like some, you know, little lady in Kansas will like call up to complain about the guest, and she's like, I don't like this Christopher Hitchens, you know, he's too much of a liberal. And he's, oh, Madame, you have insulted me more than you could know.
Yeah, it's hilarious. That's so good.
But then like in the 90s, I think, you know, and this is when he sort of started to become a little bit bigger, he especially at the end of the 90s, he writes this sort of trilogy of hate books about these figures that he particularly despises. So the one that like is most sort of consistent with his interests up until that point is Henry Kissinger. And that's, you know, pretty straightforward. You know, people can kind of understand how that one goes, which is actually the last of the 3 books in this sort of trilogy. One of them is about Bill Clinton, which at the time was a much edgier thing. I think now anybody with like broadly leftist views like can like look back at Bill Clinton and be like, oh yeah, that guy really sucked. But I think at the time, a lot of people in a sort of progressive-ish sphere were very defensive of the Clintons, because, you know, they, you know, like the kind of shape of the culture war at the time was, you know, Newt Gingrich and Rush Limbaugh would be attacking them all the time, and they would sort of feel defensive of them. And Hitchens wrote this like absolutely savage book attacking mostly Bill Clinton, to some extent Hillary Clinton too, No One Left to Lie To. And a lot of that, again, is about stuff like, you know, the death penalty, and Bill Clinton as governor, you know, not personally presided over the execution to score tough on crime points during the 1992 election. Billy Ray Rector, who's this profoundly mentally disabled black man in Arkansas, and like who, allegedly asked for some of his last meal to be saved for later, because he just didn't understand what was happening to him. A lot of it's about welfare reform and the kind of Dickensian horrors of that. And so again, I think that one, at least looking back at, a lot of people can be like, okay, fair enough, right? Henry Kissinger, Bill Clinton, like anybody you could see with sort of broadly left-wing values, you can see why they would hate them. Mm-hmm. But then the one that I think even now, like a lot of people when they first hear about, they're like, wait, what? Is Mother Teresa.
Mm-hmm. Oh wow.
Yeah. Right. It's so counterintuitive just based on our culture.
So actually, I don't know about this. So what did he have to say about Mother Teresa?
Okay. Yeah. So Mother Teresa, he wrote a book about, and whatever else you want to say about Christopher Hitchens, he had a flair for titles. The name of the book is The Missionary Position, Mother Teresa in Theory and Practice. And the book. And it's actually really interesting because in the 2000s, so much of Hitchens' emphasis would be on militant atheism. And that wasn't a new position that he suddenly started taking in the 2000s. I mean, there are things that you can find throughout his career where he says things very much like what he would say like in 2008 and in 2007 and God is not great. But like there are essays from like the early 80s where he says stuff like that. And I talked to his brother, Peter Hitchens, who told me that he thought that was like Christopher's most consistent position. He estimated from the age of about 11 onward. But given that, it is really striking how, even though this is a position he held throughout his life, it wasn't something that he emphasized that much until the last years. And even in this Mother Teresa book in the late 90s, it's not really a particularly anti-religious or even really anti-Catholic book. There's like a part of it where he's debunking this like alleged miracle that happened at the House of the Dying in Calcutta. That's like a little bit of a preview of later Hitchens, but for the most part, that's not really where his emphasis is. His emphasis is on stuff like Mother Teresa lending her aura of moral credibility to like these just awful, regimes like the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti, and like, palling around with these third world dictators and making excuse, saying they were great friends of the poor, and also, taking all of this money that people donated. To be fair, she never exactly lied about this, but like, I think people presumably, right, were under the impression that, in a great many cases, that what their money would go to would be to be like helping, dying people at like this, at the House of the Dying in Calcutta, and other places like that she had in various other parts of the world, when really most of that seemed to be going to religious missionary work, and in her actual work with dying people, she didn't I mean, like, this gets really ghoulish. I mean, like, she didn't actually like blow any of the money on like anesthetics, right? Because she actually seems to have had this view that like suffering brings you closer to God, and so it's like pretty grim stuff. Like I actually think I think the quote that was read earlier, gives people some flavor. I'm very, I think there are like lots of really important things that Hitchens got wrong, but I mean, I actually don't think this is one of them. I think he makes his case pretty thoroughly. That Mother Teresa, is somebody who, I mean, is unfortunately kind of unsuccessful. That he's like, I think now to most people, like unless they're really specifically familiar with this. Like you say, Mother Teresa, like this sort of immediate connotation is like, saintliness and compassion and all that stuff. But I think he makes a really good case that that's not at all how we should be remembering her.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like when you think about her, I mean, I guess it's pretty much we idealize her because in our culture, she's like, sort of the top of the heap in terms of humanity. When we think of the people who we aspire to be, it's like Christ and then it's Mother Teresa. So here's this guy, right? This kind of revolutionary figure who says, no, 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 you guys fucked this all up. You got this all wrong. She's actually a terrible human being. So that's what I love so much about Hitch, that he was able to kind of take these, I guess, kind of more mainstream perspectives and show the kind of nuance of them, which obviously is indicated in your book about him.
Yeah, like even Bill Clinton, for instance, right? I mean, me growing up in the 90s, especially before social media, before people were a little more well informed about what the story is with the Clintons.
Right.
Essentially, the image that I had of him was, okay, the economy was doing pretty well during him, and yeah, he had that thing with Monica Lewinsky, and there were jokes, but he seemed like an okay president, and and that's just like, I'm just saying that was my thing growing up.
It's like approximately equivalent to if you're around sort of consensus liberalism. There's like all the stuff about how like Barack Obama's like his biggest scandal was that he wore a tan suit once, right?
Mm-hmm.
People will say things like that. It's like, and create all these jobs, this and that.
And there's Syria and drones and
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, well, what about all that, right? And so it's sort of the rough equivalent where it's like, yeah, that the sort of the kind of like even like if you think about like the West Wing, that TV show that was very transparently supposed to be this sort of like idealized, cleaned up, version of the Clinton administration. But like really the only difference, particularly other than the fact that it seemed to be more like, like they're, I mean, really the only difference between the Bartlett administration of the West Wing and the Clinton administration of the real world is that like Jed Bartlett was a good family man who wasn't fucking around. I mean, like that seems to be about it, right? So like, I guess that's the only complaint that you have about Bill Clinton, not like the fact that as a Democratic president, he oversaw the destruction of the federal welfare system that was put in place under the New Deal. That he got through all these free trade agreements that just ravaged the sort of bargaining power of like big industrial unions and had like devastating effects on parts of the country like the one where I'm from, that he put through the was it the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act in 1996, which is exactly what it sounds like, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But I mean, I think it's really a sign, like the way that whoever's president who's a Democrat, like, and I don't know what the story like this is going to be about Biden, but like whoever's president who's Democrat, if you're around certain kinds of like kind of normie liberal spaces, then then you just like basically remember it's like, oh, that was like totally fine, and like whatever, maybe it's like a little bit imperfect around the edges. Whereas I think for a variety of reasons, one thing that Hitchens could add to this is this outside perspective for a couple reasons, right? I mean, one most obviously that he wasn't an American, or I mean, he eventually became a naturalized American citizen, but like that he obviously grew up in the UK, and his politics were formed, before he moved to the United States. He was, and then two, that he just came from an outsider political perspective. He'd been a Trotskyist in like the 60s and early 70s, and so part of a group called the International Socialists in the UK when he was at Oxford, and afterwards, that basically saw like what happened like in 1968 when in France there were these this kind of student uprising and workers' general strike that almost brought down the de Gaulle government, and at the same time in Czechoslovakia there was the Prague Spring, which was this kind of reformist experiment that was eventually crushed by Soviet tanks. And they saw that, right, because they were from this kind of revolutionary Marxist perspective, the IS was extremely critical of both of the systems. As their slogan was neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism, as this kind of like rumblings of global revolution against both of them. And Hitchens drifted out of the IS, by the early to mid 70s, partly because of sort of factional wrangling that's like not even worth trying to reconstruct like what it was about, because far left groups are like that. But I think more substantively because he kind of realized that 1968 wasn't actually the beginning of something. It was, at least for the moment, like the end of something. That wasn't like, there wasn't going to be this like wave of global revolution in the 70s. That had all gone into retreat. But even after that, right, and even as like I think a more moderate kind of socialist in many ways, right? I think probably to the extent that he thought about issues like this, probably his conception of how you get from capitalism to some sort of socialist future was probably more incremental and social democratic. But in terms of his values, in terms of his like long-term goals, and and all that stuff, I mean, he there's a lot that was continuous from that early Trotskyist period, right? And in fact, in interesting ways, there's a lot that was continuous, even like to the bitter end, from that. But certainly, like the 80s and 90s, there was. So as such, right? I mean, I think that both as a non-American and as a non-liberal, just as somebody who comes from a socialist and in many ways pretty radical socialist background, and can kind of look at that and be like, oh yeah, I mean, I don't even, like even sort of like, whatever, like even like, early 70s George McGovern liberalism is not this, it like doesn't sound that great to me, right? And like whatever the hell you want to call this in the 90s, this is just awful, right? That they like, so, and somebody who wasn't really that invested in the kind of day-to-day sort of political wars as there existed in the United States, and has that very different political perspective, could come into this and be like, yeah, why do any of you people like this guy? I don't get it.
Yeah. Right. I mean, this is going to kind of be a silly question, but I do think it might be important. So do you think that if, let's say, because the things that he outlines, right, especially just in terms of, let's kind of put religion on the shelf for now, but the things that he outlines in terms of like foreign and domestic policy, right, these seem like ideas that most people agree with, at least today, right? So I wonder, is it particularly the socialist label that put people off, or was it just the fact that like he was just, kind of an iconoclast, sort of throwing everything in the bucket and debunking like American sort of exceptionalism altogether? I guess I wonder if he were to sort of appeal more so to the broader public, what would that have looked like? Because some of these ideas do seem pretty sensible, especially his foreign policy ones.
Yeah, so I think that I think it's probably worth making a distinction if we're talking about 90s Hitchens right now, which I think what we're talking about.
Yeah, right.
Whether that, which in some ways I should say on some of the foreign policy stuff is a little bit of a weird transitional period, because in broad brush, most of the ways that he talks about America's role in the world in the 90s is like pretty much the way he talked about it in the 80s and the 70s. That that like he wrote a book called Blood, Class, and Empire about the Anglo-American relationship, and don't remember where the line is actually in the book, but like certainly in like some of the like press he did about it, interviews and stuff afterwards, he has this nice line about how he it's really unfortunate. One of the things that's kind of driving him to like think about this and write the book is this frustration that about what Anglophile means in the US, and what pro-American means in the UK. That like Anglophile in the US means that he said, was it you like masterpiece theater and country houses and the monarchy and all that shit, and pro-American in the UK means like you want our lads at MI5 to be best friends with the boys at Langley, and he says it'd be much better if it were that Anglophile meant that you wanted the United States to replicate Britain's National Health Service, and pro-American meant that you wanted the UK to replicate America's Freedom of Information Act, right? So he's still saying a lot of things like this, but at the same time, on foreign policy, he is even though I think overall he has this very negative view of America's role in the world, the 90s are when he starts to warm up to the idea that sometimes, at least locally, that American military power could actually be a force for good. And this is actually really interesting in terms of thinking about late Hitch and what certainly from my perspective what went wrong there, because I think it is really telling, when people want to like sort of attribute like the bad post 9/11 positions that he had just to Islamophobia, that the first war where he starts to warm up to the idea that American military force can't be a force for good in the world is not one where the United States is bombing Muslims. It's actually one where the United States is intervening on behalf of Bosnian Muslims against Serbian Christians in the wars of the former Yugoslavia, first in Bosnia and then Kosovo in the 90s. And so I think this kind of transitional period, Hitchens, I think he is starting to get a wider hearing, with some of the public. And I think who he is alienating specifically is people who are even in a place like the Nation, which has always occupied slightly ambiguous territory between like mainstream liberalism and something to the left of that. Hitchens was a columnist there in the 80s and 90s. Alexander Coburn, who was probably always to Hitchens' left in certain respects, although he's also an eccentric guy at his own right with some odd views. But Coburn was a columnist there, in the same time period. But at the same time, it's enough within the space of sort of conventional liberal media that I think being there and being quite as anti-Clinton as he was, did alienate him from some people even there, and certainly in the kind of broader world of like kind of DC progressive-y politics and media, that he was part of. And then especially, I mean, I really wish there had been some way to write about this in the book, but I just, there's just no natural, it's one of like a million things. There's just no natural way to work it in. There's a point where, because one of the things he does talk about, in the Clinton book is the way that the Clinton machine would kind of like go after and like smear these women who, told the truth about, their experiences with Bill Clinton. And sort of like portray them as like crazy sluts and stalkers and, and all this stuff. And I think he was like really morally offended by that in ways that like, I think it's interesting actually the way the culture has changed since then, because I think like
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think post Me Too, this would all play very differently, but
right, very, yeah.
But so as part of that, right, like in the Ken Starr investigation, Sidney Blumenthal who is somebody who worked for Clinton, who is was actually a really, there's some interesting family dynamics there, because this is also Max Blumenthal's dad, if people know who that is. But had, I think I might be getting the details of this slightly wrong, but I think he testified that like basically nobody had ever told him to like go out and defame Monica Lewinsky to the press. And then Hitchens like got mad enough about that he actually like gave testimony and being like, no, actually Sidney Blumenthal gave me this file of like, of like Oppo basically about Monica Lewinsky being a crazy slut and a stalker and all this. And at the time, I mean, he was like really reviled for that, because like, he, there's this, he just ratted out his friend, right? So it's like, it was sort of the way that was portrayed. And I don't even think this is 100% wrong, is that it's like, this is just this huge act of, disloyalty. And, it's like naming names to, HUAC or something like that, it's like, okay, there's an element of that I can see. But like, I think again, post Me Too, all of this would play very, very differently. And I think if all this happened now, I think there'd be a lot more sympathy for the position that he was taking there. But like, that sort of shows the kind of depths of his hostility to the Clinton administration in the 90s. So I think that even though I think he was kind of throughout the 90s starting to have a bigger presence in national media, you know, it was ready for Vanity Fair and like probably more, you know, public profile and to actually get more people listening to what he had to say, right? You know, to go to your question, I think very specifically within that kind of world of liberal media, like he was, he was probably like isolated himself a lot more in ways that are probably psychologically relevant to what happened later, because, you know, like it made it easier for him, I think, to just kind of part ways entirely with some of these people.
Mhm. Yeah, wow. And so just to change gears a little bit, right? Because the part about your book that I think I found the most fascinating are the different versions of communism / socialism.
Yeah.
So, you know, it kind of in our community, right? And I know Alan could definitely attest to this. So because we're technically Russian / Ukrainian. So in our community, everything is socialism, right? So if you're a Democrat, you're a socialist. If you're a liberal, you're a socialist, right? Everybody's a communist. So it's so interesting that there's so much nuance here, right? That you could be a Trotskyist, you could be a Stalinist, right? You could be a democratic socialist, you know, kind of a la Bernie Sanders. But the idea here is that there's so many different versions of it that it's sort of, it's not just, so it's not just unethical. I mean, it is, I guess, you know, if you're being dishonest about it, but it's also a little bit stupid to lump everybody into the same category. So just, can you talk a little bit about what kind of socialist Christopher Hitchens was, right? And kind of, can we kind of distinguish that between the different forms available, especially in contrasting Stalinism with Trotskyism?
Yeah. So I try to do this kind of weird thing in the book where, because what you're talking about is so important for understanding the background here, sort of felt like, okay, it has to be in the book, but like also, you know, there's so much else that does, right? So like I sort of try to do like, here's like kind of the history of socialism in 4 pages, and you know, I guess people could judge for themselves, you know, how successful that is or not. But but I guess like the way I think about it is, you know, very roughly in, you know, you start with like people like Marx and Engels, the 19th century, and you think about, there's a theory of history here, which is actually probably pretty important to understand for like understanding Hitchens, because even though I think there's some weird contradictions in his use of it, I think it was at least important to his understanding of what he thought, right? You know, that he still subscribed to sort of some form of it in some watered down way, you know, to the bitter end, which roughly says that what really kind of drives forward historical development is the development of the productive forces of a society, just meaning like you know, the capacity of a society to produce stuff, right? And that's going to be intimately related to what the relations of production are, meaning, you know, whether you have capitalism or feudalism or socialism or what, right? Like how different class, you know, like, are there different classes? How are they related to each other? So I think broadly speaking, if you think about like the earliest human societies that you could actually call societies, you're talking about like hunter-gatherer tribes, stuff like that, and those are going to be sort of communist by default, because they have to be super duper egalitarian, because like you just don't have enough food to go around for some people to be like aristocrats who are like, you know, living without working, right? You know, so
yeah, they'd be killed off, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. If that ever, and that's, and just a quick aside, that's actually what happened in hunter-gatherer society. So if you had like greedy kind of hunters or whatever, right, the tribe would kind of get together and just like kill them all off.
Right. So then you have the agricultural revolution, and you know, people start to settle to agriculture and livestock and all that stuff, and that creates at least the possibility of class society now. And very broadly speaking, I mean, a lot of this is sort of going by it's a book that I just finished teaching a class on that I know was very important to Hitchens. He mentions it a few places. Karl Marx's Theory of History and Defense by Jacobin And sort of the way that Cohen periodizes it there, right? You have those sort of early like primitive communism we were talking about. You have pre-capitalist class societies, slavery, feudalism, whatever, where basically you can have a ruling class now, right? It's there is enough to go around for that, but also like the only way to make that work, given the level of development of the productive forces, is to by like pretty crude coercion, right? You're a feudal peasant, right? That there's that like whatever, it works slightly different ways, different versions of feudalism, whether you have to spend a certain number of weeks a year tilling the Lord's fields instead of yours, or whether you're just tilling one field, but like you have to give up some of your crops, to the Lord or whatever. But like, there's like a guy with a sword ultimately who's enforcing this like in a very direct, crude way. And then, you get to the point where you have, the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism. You have it's both no longer sort of convenient for the further development of these productive forces that people are tied to the land the way that feudal serfs are, because what you really need for that system is a very mobile laboring class that can that can just sort of move to where the work is and have and can enter into a contract with any boss, an employment contract. So Marx has this great phrase about how workers under capitalism have to be doubly free, by which he means both legally free to sort of sign an employment contract with whoever, but also free from any way of supporting themselves without signing an employment contract with a boss. So in other words, that even though it's not a guy with a sword, it's just like, the kind of blind force of economic compulsion, still have no realistic choice except to submit themselves to a ruling class, because, you have to, in these sort of early factories that, like William Blake was writing about in his poem Jerusalem, when he's got that phrase about the dark satanic mills, that where people are going to work for like 16 hours a day or something in this like incredibly dirty, noisy, dangerous environments, right? Nobody's going to do that if they have an alternate means of supporting themselves, right? You're only going to do that if you have no realistic choice except to do that or to starve. And then the Marxist analysis would be, there's, of course, over the course of the development of capitalism, due to the growth and development of trade unions and worker struggles and labor laws and welfare states starting to form and et cetera, right? Some of the rough edges that are softened over time and goes down from like 16 hours to 12 hours to 8 hours, right? But the it's and the alternative maybe isn't quite as rough as starvation, but still like long term, like you got to have a job or you're not going to survive. And so it's still the case that for half of your waking hours most days of the week, you have to sell, you have to essentially sell 8 out of your 16 hours of being awake a day to a unelected figure who's going to give you orders. And so the claim that that Marxist theory is going to make is that as this system develops, it's going to be very like cruel in many ways in human terms, but it is going to like really build up the industrial machinery of society, and it's going to build it up to the point where it makes it possible that you could have egalitarianism again, but like not an egalitarian distribution of scarcity like in those sort of early hunter-gatherer, primitive communist societies, but an egalitarian distribution of material abundance. That you could have a society where workers are collectively and democratically, controlling the forces of production, and so maybe even like because if workers are controlling the factories and the farms and all this stuff, when new labor-saving technology is developed, instead of what happens under capitalism, that it's that maybe everybody has to work just as hard, but like more stuff is being produced, so therefore there's more profit, or everybody who's still there has to work just as hard, but like half the people get laid off, and because you can do it with twice little, then workers can collectively and democratically decide, okay, what's our priority here? Do we, we could do this, we could just keep everybody have the same standard of living. You have to just work fewer hours. So that's kind of the promise of socialism or communism is, Marx and Engels, use those terms mostly and synonymously, although there's also tradition of using communism to mean like the sort of more advanced, kind of stage of a socialist society as it could develop in the future. And so this is more or less what everybody thinks. And by the way, one of the consequences of this theory is that where socialist revolution has to have as a precondition the development of like really advanced industrial capitalism. But in the early 20th century, there actually is a socialist revolution, but it happens in one of the least developed capitalist countries in the world, in Russia, and which in fact is sort of barely a capitalist society at all. Is actually kind of still a weird mixture of capitalism and something sort of residually feudal, when that revolution happens in 1917. And so the original understanding of Lenin and Trotsky as the leaders of that revolution, which was like a very orthodox Marxist understanding, was that, well, okay, the only way we're going to be able to have socialism in Russia is if the revolution spreads to Western Europe and crucially to Germany. And like, so there's this sort of advanced industrial base, and it's sort of within this world, system that will have this advanced industrial base built up, because obviously we can't have it in one backward, largely agrarian, society. But then, and people's assumption also at the time was that, either that was going to happen or it would just be crushed anyway. So, so that it would sort of be a non-issue. But then what happens is exactly what nobody expected, which is that the Bolsheviks win the Civil War and they hold on to power in Russia, but it also doesn't spread outside of, the former Russian Empire at this point, right? I mean, like it starts to at different points in the late teens and early 20s, but all of that is crushed. And, and this sort of revolutionary outbursts that happened in Germany and Hungary and places like that. And ultimately, the Soviet Union is still under the control of the socialist, revolutionary party, but it's isolated within that. And so you have this factional struggle within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the 20s that goes in a few different directions, and there's so Trotsky's perspective is that he thinks that you should have this renewed emphasis on world revolution and like spreading the revolution elsewhere, and that's and linked to that that you need to be try to build up the industrial base in Russia, and also that that he thinks that sort of workers' democracy, which was supposed to be the whole point, has started to really fade away quite a bit, by the 1920s, right? That there's when the revolution happens originally, there's quite a lot of that, right? In at least the sort of islands of industrial capitalism that existed in the former Russian Empire, you have workers' councils and factory committees and all this stuff. And over the course of the this like extremely bloody and gruesome civil war, I mean, most of that gets lost in the way that this happens in civil wars, right? That generally speaking, any society, however democratic it is to start with, however it'll become way less so by the end of a civil war, as a general rule. That if you're very lucky, it'll be like the United States, where it sort of comes back later, but it wasn't really coming back very much in Russia. So this is the Trotskyist perspective, and then you get people like Stalin and Bukharin, who ultimately end up falling out with each other, but who think that actually you can have like socialism within a single country, and even within a single sort of very backward country, which is a pretty striking revision of classical Marxist ideas. But then you have this further division between those two factions ultimately, right? Because so Trotsky's group is called the left opposition. Bukharin's faction, probably not by themselves, but is referred to by other people as the right opposition. And because what Bukharin thinks, which is more or less what Lenin thought at the very end, is that basically, if you were going to do socialism in one country, what you'd have to do is a sort of very, at the very least for a prolonged transitional period, you'd have to have this like pretty gentle kind of market socialism where you had, because like most people were still going to be smallholding peasants, and you didn't want to alienate, the revolution relied on the alliance between those people and the industrial working class. So the way to sort of bring socialism to the countryside was sort of by very gradually incentivizing the peasants to like pool together into rural cooperatives and stuff like that. And ultimately, where Stalin ends up going after defeating his various factional enemies is consolidating, making what was already becoming disturbingly authoritarian by the 20s, like much, much more authoritarian, and closely linked to this, doing trying to, like what socialism in one country ultimately ended up meaning for Stalin was that you'd sort of solve this problem about, how you're supposed to have this advanced industrial base by just sort of doing this like rapid fire industrialization within the Soviet Union, where you like forced peasants onto, like sort of drove them by force onto these collective farms, and you had and you had this kind of breakneck speed of industrial development that involved, like really making workers, like work, fulfill these crazy quotas and stuff like that. And of course, you can't do any of that without becoming pretty much what the Soviet Union became by the 30s. That there's no way realistically, because what you're doing is essentially you're doing what, like Tony Cliff, who is the founder of the Trotskyist group in Britain that Christopher Hitchens was part of in the 60s and 70s, has a book called State Capitalism in Russia, or I think the original edition is called The Class Nature of Stalinist Russia, where he points out that essentially what was happening in Russia in the 30s was what happened in Great Britain over the course of like, a couple hundred years of enclosures of like common peasant land to, sort of force peasants off their land, and so people ended up having no choice except to work in these awful factories, et cetera, which was like a pretty brutal process even in Britain, right? I mean, that was like a really violent process even there, but it was like 100 times more violent in the Soviet Union because they were like cramming it all into like one 5-year plan basically. And so different. Trotsky himself didn't have quite as radical a rejection of what the Soviet Union was at this point as that, right? I mean, to the end of his life, Trotsky is assassinated in 1940. Trotsky thinks that the Soviet Union is, he uses the phrase degenerated worker state, which means that like it's gotten really bad, right? It's degenerated. It has to be fixed. Maybe it even requires some sort of revolution to fix it, but there's some sort of salvageable socialist core there. But then like within the Trotskyist movement afterwards, like Tony Cliff writes this book in 1948, he has a much more radical analysis of it where he basically says there's nothing socialist about what the USSR is at this point. It's just this like weird mutant form of capitalism where like the state is kind of one big corporation, and it's really not fundamentally different from capitalism. That's the tradition that so when sort of Christopher Hitchens becomes a Marxist in the 1960s, that's the kind of Marxism that he's coming into, right? So he has so he's always so even after he leaves the IS, right, even in the 80s, right, I mean he's very much a pox on both their houses guy about the Cold War, that they so he's very supportive of dissidents, especially ones who are considered themselves to be some kind of socialist in the Soviet bloc, like he's supportive of stuff like Solidarność, the workers movement, that was crushed in Poland, in the 80s, and in 1989 when those regimes start to crumble, he's all for it, right? But then I think that even though he was super duper anti-Stalinist, I still think that like he had this political perspective that was shaped by the Cold War, even though he was like against both sides of it. And then like in terms of understanding then what happens to him in the 90s and 2000s. I think that's where all of this background becomes relevant, because I think as the world starts to change after the Cold War, I think there's a certain way in which he's not sure what to make of that. And like, as he's kind of trying to find his bearings, you know, in that new world, that's kind of when his politics start to shift.
Right. And I mean, it sort of seems like, you know, just for the sake of, I guess, humanity, or for his love of humanity, he's a contrarian, right? Where we think
Yeah.
about we think about like these two forces, and you know, it's like if you kind of look at the Rocky movies and whatnot, and sort of just
Yeah.
pop culture, what pop culture was
Yeah.
producing at the time, right? It's like you have to pick like these two forces, and then here comes Hitchens, and he says, no, they all are really terrible, right? So there's this sort of underlying love of humanity that neither government really possesses. And so, right, when I kind of mentioned before that as a Russian, right, you kind of think everything is like, or everything, you know, that's anti-capitalist is sort of, you know,
Right.
communist and Stalinist,
Yep.
right? It's like when we argue with our family members, we try to kind of tell them like how unfair that is, because, you know, when we kind of get into these debates about like Medicare for all and, you know, just sort of like what we want in terms of like as a society, you know, have like some provision of like basic goods or whatever, right? You know, even jobs potentially. The idea there is like, well, you know, dictatorships want to sort of take money away from, you know, the rich or, you know, the working class or whatever, even though they don't. So it's like they want to take away they sort of want to take away money from the people who actually work, and they want to give it to the people who don't. And so I think their understanding is that, you know, the kind of the way the Russian state was built was that like they didn't really they didn't appreciate the kind of the real workers there. So sort of like so it's like they didn't appreciate the kind of workers there, and what they did was they sort of took from them, which is what like you guys kind of want to do here, what, you know, the sort of Bernie Sanders regime wants
Right.
to do. They just want to kind of take from the working class. And then, but going into Christopher Hitchens, right, he's sort of trying to defend as best as he can the working class, and he's kind of telling you that there's been a ruse pulled over you, right, by these two forms, these two different factions. That the Stalinists, right, are telling you that, yeah, you know, we're for the working class, obviously, even though we aren't, we want to actually suppress them, right, violently. And then you have the capitalist regimes that say, no, 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 I'm sorry. So you have the capitalist regimes who suppress the working class in a kind of in a bit of a sort of flowery way, and it's a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more subtle. But the idea is that, like, yeah, you know, it's like the government allows you to go into the market and allows you to compete for work, but at the end of the day, the dictatorship is different, right? It's more corporate. Whereas again, as you go into the Stalinist regime, it's kind of more what's the word? It's more sort of it's more aggressive in terms of like the actual like regime, in terms of the actual government. So it's like when we think about what we want to actually, you know, sort of tell the world, right? This is why I love early Hitchens, because you can point to these arguments, and I really want to get into some of these debates that he had, especially, you know, capitalism versus socialism. And so you go into some of these debates and what Hitchens has to say, and you're like, look, you know, you kind of can present it, and you could say, don't you want some of these things too? Don't you want like the basic kind of versions of like a, let's say, a welfare state to be to support all of us?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that, right. So, I mean, I think now, what we, you know, because I think when the Cold War ended, I think for a long time, and I mean, this is actually really relevant to the Hitchens story, because, you know, I think to understand how his politics started to change in the 90s, because these sorts of big debates about capitalism and socialism that like seemed very alive in the 1980s, after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, you know, the triumph of the West in the Cold War, I think till a lot of people, most people, you know, started to seem very irrelevant, you know, for a long time in the 90s, because it sort of seemed like, you know, if you think back to even stuff like, I don't know. There's this famous thing in the late 50s. There's this famous debate that kitchen table debate that Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev had at this like exposition in Moscow, where they were arguing about, you know, capitalism and communism, and, you know, and which system is sort of going to provide for the future of humanity. And like you think that's a kind of debate that seemed just sort of decisively settled to most people, you know, at the beginning of the 90s, that, you know, some sort of liberal capitalism had won, and all there is to do at that point is to kind of sort out the details. Like Francis Fukuyama, and to be fair, I think he's somebody a lot more people know the title of his book than have read the book, and this might be a little unfair to him, right? But like he writes this book in the 90s called The End of History, and that's kind of the way that the title of that book sort of resonates with this atmosphere in this era is that it's like, it's not that stuff isn't going to keep happening, but it's that these sorts of like big debates about how to organize a society are just kind of done, that like one side won and the other side lost, and that's that. And so I think that like Hitchens, even somebody like Hitchens, even though look, the kind of socialism or quote unquote socialism that that lost wasn't the kind he wanted anyway, right? But despite that, I think that atmosphere that it's like over and capitalism won, and when the Cold War is still going on, at least if there are two big competing options, even if your own preference is for a third option, right, like it still seems like a debate about stuff like that is very alive in ways that it doesn't feel like in the 1990s. And so I think over the course of the 90s, Hitchens like finds it harder and harder to like kind of keep the faith that this is like a live historical possibility, and by the time in 2001, before 9/11, but like it comes out like a month after 9/11. So like at the very least, I'm not sure about the publishing schedule, but it must have been written at the very least several months before that, probably more like a year before that. In his book, Letters to a Young Contrarian, he just kind of says not that he, even though in some ways he's still writing very affectionately about the socialist tradition and, some of the underlying values, like he kind of gives up in that book. He's like, look, this is just not happening. Right, that the historical moment is over. And in his memoir, Hitch 22, there are a few passages in there where he kind of reflects on this. And it's funny, actually, there's a review of my book in Quillette where like the guy got, it's like, oh, these aren't the, Ben said in the book, these are the only passages where he reflects on it, but he says this and that and the other thing. It's like, okay, just, what do you think I mean by this, right? Like he has it's not like that's the only time he ever says anything about it, right? But like these are the sort of moments where he's sort of taking a step back to like try to explain why, he made this shift. And in that he says that, he thinks in retrospect, there's a point where like he had kind of given up on it, like deep down, but he wasn't really willing to admit that to anybody else or even himself, probably, even himself. Right. But he thinks a lot of that was just kind of stubbornness, his ego. It's like every time he'd go on, there's this very funny passage where he says every time he'd go on C-SPAN, Brian Lamb would ask him in a really condescending way if he was still a socialist. And, he didn't want to give him the satisfaction of saying no, that, so it's like, I think it's really starts to wear down on him. And going back to what you were saying just now, I think that like, what's changed since then, I think, is that there has been this kind of massive dissatisfaction with the kind of capitalism that was triumphant in the 90s, and that we've had since then. That they have that, like, at least in the 90s, a lot of really bad stuff was happening to a lot of people, but like, at least it was all happening in the context of this big, economic boom, for much of the decade. And as and given everything that's happened since then, especially I think, given the meltdown of the world economy in 2008, that I think you started to get a lot more dissatisfaction with the economic status quo that like started to manifest itself in like, was it 2011, the Occupy Wall Street, and then in a slightly different form in the coming years, like in the UK, you get Jeremy Corbyn as this sort of old line representative of the sort of kind of the far left within the Labour Party spectrum, who comes back and is actually the leader of the party for several years. And in the United States, you have the Bernie Sanders phenomenon started in 2015. Which really took off in a crazy way that I think nobody, least of all Bernie himself, anticipated. Like if you go back and watch the footage of the press conference in 2015 where he announces that he's running for president, it's like just him, right? Like I don't even like there's no he's like going out like on his lunch break or something for the Senate, and he's got this like little folded up sheet of paper in his pocket with his speech on it. And he takes as, I'm not going to have a lot of time to answer questions, you know, and there are like 10 reporters there or something, right? You know? So, you know, he definitely thought he was doing this kind of symbolic gesture of frustration, you know, with the neoliberal status quo when he was running. But then it really caught on. And I think that you have, you know, you have stuff like, you know, you have stuff like the Democratic Socialists of America has gotten to be a much bigger deal than it was, you know, sort of in 2015, just kind of a glorified mailing list of a few hundred people. Right. And now there's, I don't even know, 100,000, you know, a couple 100,000 people. Most of them are, you know, a lot more of them are much more active. And you have like a few members of Congress, you know, who are at least somewhat aligned with it, whatever. You have, you know, Jacobin, which, you know, not to inflate our importance in the world, you know, I mean, it's a, you know, I mean, it's still, you know, it's still a very minor, you know, magazine in the greater scheme of things, but like, you know, it's gigantic compared to any socialist magazine that existed, you know, like, right. You know, 12 years ago, right? You know, that they, so I think what you have now though, is this sort of combination of a couple things. You were talking about like having some kind of welfare state. And I think that that's, so there's like, I think when people talk about socialism, you know, they mean maybe two different things. One of them is what I would think of as social democracy, which is the idea that you should have, you know, not just a welfare state, but like a particular kind of welfare state, that you should have like not like means tested programs where there's some like bureaucrat scrutinizing whether you're quite poor and miserable enough to qualify, you know, for some kind of help, but you should have these like broad sweeping universal programs that like everybody gets just for being a person, you know, that you get, you know, everybody can have health care, you know, nobody has to pay tuition to go to college, you know, things like that. Right. And that's, you know, which is often things that have been accomplished in especially like Scandinavian countries by socialist parties, you know, they've been elected to power, often allied to strong labor unions. And that's all good stuff. And I mean, that's all the stuff that I think could actually be achieved anytime soon, right? You know, and it's incredibly important. But then you've got this sort of much more nebulous idea that.
All right, guys, we're back from some technical difficulties and we're going to continue where we left off. All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think all I was saying when we cut off is just that I think that when people now use this word socialism, I think because there's been like quite so much of a triumph of you know, free market capitalism in decades leading up to this, I think that it means two things. One of the, like most of the time, it just kind of means social democracy, you know, which is what like socialist parties would have traditionally called like the minimum program, you know, the sort of universal healthcare and, you know, all that stuff.
Right.
But then I think some people, at least, I think a lot of people, when they use that term, I mean, they are kind of gesturing in a more sort of systemic dissatisfaction with the way that capitalism works. Although I also think that a lot of people are unsure about what a different, what like a sort of fundamentally different kind of economic system might look like, that, you know, didn't just replicate, you know, like all of the problems of, you know, like of the socialist experiments of the 20th century, which I'll just, you know, I mean, not that there's anything to plug, it's not going to exist for at least a year, but like that is the book I'm working on right now with Bhaskar Sankara, who's the editor of Jacobin, and Mike Beggs, who's a economics professor. Is kind of a book about what like a sort of long-term socialist vision of society that would be better would look like. So, you know, Bhaskar's a Jay-Z fan, so he wants to call it the blueprint.
That's awesome.
That's so cool. And then, so kind of circling back to where we began, right? If you had to, I mean, this is obviously kind of a little bit of a creative sort of, I guess, experiment or way of thinking about things. Where do you think Hitch would have been at this, I guess, at this kind of juncture in the world or in life or whatever?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. So I think that, but I think there's like a range of possibilities.
Mhm.
So, and I think like that's not totally uninformative, because I think there are things that we can rule out because they're outside of the range. Like, so, because where he ultimately, of course, ends up going is that, you know, he has these horrible post 9/11 foreign policy positions that, you know, he ends up, you know, having kind of given up on the idea that there's going to be this wave of sort of socialist transformations from below, which, you know, presumably would have, you know, all these like sort of tin pot despotisms like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, you know, would have been swept into the dustbin of history, you know, Marxist language by that, right? Having given up on that, you know, he's willing to sort of have the 82nd Airborne Division do at least a democratic transformation of these societies from above, which I think is, you know, we've seen as a disaster. Like over the course of the last 20 years. I mean, you know, think about the last year, the end of the war in Afghanistan. That's the long, bloody 20-year transition from the Taliban to the Taliban. You know, like it's. I think the idea that it even could happen that way, I think is just a tragic mistake. And you know, I mean, a crime, you know, in terms of people committing it, but in terms of people who thought it could happen that way, a tragic mistake. And so he did all that, and he was a lot of his focus in the last years of his life was in a, you know, for somebody who's as hyper political as Hitchens, in so sort of strange sort of way, was less about politics than about metaphysics. He'd been doing these debates about religion and atheism. So where would he have politically landed if he'd lived longer? Well, I think the more, you know, if you imagine him beating to cancer in 2011, I think the more years you're imagining him living, of course, the harder it is to answer that question, because like the world has changed in so many ways since then, right? You know, you end up like doing these like questions like, I don't know, what would, you know, like what would Christopher Hitchens have, you know, have thought about COVID? It's like, I don't know, you know, but I think what's a little bit easier is to not take us all the way to 2022, but to like do like 5 years after he died, like 2016,
right.
Which is already a time when politics have really realigned in some significant ways that that they've kind of stayed realigned since then. And you can really see, like, because like all of his like new atheist buddies in the late 2000s, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, you know, like these are all people who've like gone in various directions, because like the sort of culture war moment within which new atheism made sense is sort of gone now, and you know, their people are divided about different issues, and so they've gone, you know, they've gone different ways. But like if you imagine Christopher Hitchens in like the 2016 election, what are the range of possibilities? Well, I think it is a little bit tricky, especially if you're thinking about the general election, because he hated the Clintons so much that would he have been able to like suck it up and vote for Hillary in 2016? Maybe not, right? But the one thing I am 100% morally certain of is that there's no version of Hitchens that would have ever been pro-Trump. And I think there's a lot of evidence of that, not just in like the few statements that he actually made about Donald Trump, which are pretty scattered, right? You know, because obviously he wasn't a big, you know, figure in the same way, right? You know, so like there's a C-SPAN thing where he's, you know, Brian Lamb probably asks him what he thinks about Donald Trump. And he says, as far as I can tell, the only impressive thing about that man is that he found a way to cover 90% of his skull with 10% of his hair. And there's another one where he, in 2000, when Trump was a candidate for the Reform Party nomination, which is bizarre to think about, this guy who later became president of the United States, you know, lost to, you know, Pat Buchanan. But in a Nation column about that race for the Reform Party nomination, Hitchens refers to Trump as a nutball narcissistic tycoon. So it's not, but I think the personal dislike for Trump is the least of it. I think that like the bigger thing is that sort of like America first, you know, xenophobic, you know, at least rhetorically isolationist nationalism is just in many, many ways for, you know, I think any stage of Christopher Hitchens would have hated that. And if you look at stuff like what he wrote in 2009, a couple of years before he died, when Glenn Beck did this rally in Washington, D.C. Against Obama, Hitchens wrote about it, and he referred to the rally as the water world of white self-pity. He had he had some, certainly his racial politics. I mean, he was, even after he, went wrong from my perspective on foreign policy in 2001. After that happened, he did a debate where he was arguing in favor of reparations, and he later has an essay about that, right? So I think I don't think we can imagine a version of Hitchens that's pro-Trump. So given that, what are the range of possibilities? I think that the best one, obviously the one that I would like to believe in, is that in 2015, 2016, with the rise of the Bernie phenomenon, that like rekindles some of his old leftist economic views, and that he supports it because of that. Now, I think it would have been complicated, because I think it would have been really psychologically difficult for him to walk back some of the foreign policy stuff. I mean, who knows, as some of those wars dragged on year after year after year, right? Like it might have been really hard to, I mean, it might be hard to predict exactly, maybe something, he would have like admitted, he admitted he was wrong about stuff like that. But I just have a really hard time imagining, just because that was such a bitter break between him and so many of his old friends and comrades, that he would like, and the fact that, I mean, this was, whatever else is true, I mean, like I love so much of the guy's writing, but I mean, like, he did have like an ego the size of a planet, like that. Like I have a really hard time imagining him just coming out and saying like, "Oh, you guys were all right and I was wrong," right? That's tricky. So I think it would have been complicated by some of the foreign policy stuff, but I think it is I think I can imagine him supporting Bernie in 2016. Like I think Jeremy Corbyn, I think it'd be much harder to imagine because some of the foreign policy stuff, but also I think by that point, he was like, already by the time he died, he was much more focused on American than British politics. And I think Bernie Sanders, I think that is within the realm of what's imaginable, that he could have been a Bernie supporter in 2016, especially because he did hate Hillary Clinton so much. I mean, one of the first things I say at the beginning of the book is that like, if the Bernie campaign had a little bit more of a killer instinct, they would have like bought up in mass and sold at rallies, that no one left to lie to. But also because there's this one really specific moment in the Democratic primaries in 2016 that I have a hard time imagining Hitchens not responding to, which is that in one of those debates, Hillary Clinton, was talking about how, Henry Kissinger was this like good friend and trusted advisor, and Bernie Sanders kind of made this point of it, I'm very proud to say Henry Kissinger is not my friend, right? And like whatever else is true, I have a hard time imagining like Hitchens and whatever like DC bar he was watching that debate, like not at least having like some warm thoughts about Bernie and at least writing a column about it. Like I think at the very least that would have happened. Maybe he would have even been a Bernie supporter in 2016. And again, I think it's possible that the revival of all that would have rekindled some of his economic leftist views. I think that the worst version of Hitchens that I could realistically imagine, again, it wouldn't be like a Trumpist or anything like that. And I don't think he even would have like really ended up in the, so-called IDW, right, intellectual dark web, with people like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, right? I don't think he even would have ended up there for various reasons we can talk about, right? But I think the worst version of him I can imagine would be that like basically somebody who was like very, very anti-Trump in a way I'd find really annoying, in that sort of like resistance liberal kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I love that so much. All right, Alan, final questions for Ben before we wrap up?
Oh, yes. If we wanted to follow your work, where could we find you?
Yeah, so the easiest thing to do is to go to benburgis.com, Burgis, and you can find links to just about everything there. It's Ben Burgis on Twitter. And the show that I host is Give Them an Argument, which you can find at YouTube and all the standard podcast places. But again, the show, the Jacobin column, and the social media stuff and everything else, you can find it all at that website, benburgis.com.
Excellent.
Awesome.
And Ben, so again, thank you so much for coming on. And just to our audience, man, I really, really want to strongly stress this is one of the best books that I've read in the past couple of years. So you get everything from it. Not only do you get this history of this incredible man, but you get just the intellectual history of the past probably 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever years, right? Philosophy, politics, history, you name it. So guys, please get the book. Ben, again, thank you so much for coming on, man. This was great.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
All right, talk soon.
Bye.
All right. That was awesome. So guys, if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. And thank you so much for watching. See you next time.